Welcome to the fourth and final part of Trojan Adventuring Party's four-part DM series. Today we will be talking about the most popular, most questioned topic that I've seen, how to run your own story in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Now, before we get this started, a couple of disclaimers. First, this video is not meant at all to give you ideas for what you want your homebrew campaign to be like, but rather how to implement those ideas. Second, I see a lot of recommendation for new DMs that instead of trying to build out their own story, they simply buy a module and run an adventure like that to get them used to DMing. I can definitely sympathize with that philosophy, but I also see that in practice a lot of people feel more comfortable with something they have complete creative control over and something that they don't have to spend money on. If the hobby does not go further than that, or if they don't feel that the investment is particularly worth it for any litany of reasons. And I can sympathize with both of those perspectives. So given how common homebrewing your own story campaign is, even at the beginner level, I thought it would be worthwhile to generally cover the structure of making your own story. This is not dealing with balancing encounters. This is not dealing with getting maps, with exactly how much detail prep you need to do, if you have any homebrew monster elements, anything like that. This is just about creating the story, which is the part I see cause people the most stress. Because it's one thing having a fantastic idea of a story in your mind, and it is another thing actually implementing that and getting it to the outline stage so you can have all of those details filled out. So, we will start with the debate over the medium. Dungeons & Dragons is an interactive role-playing game, and so similar to things like video games, there is debate over the sandbox format, where everybody can play in whatever sand they want and go to whatever regions they want, and it's just kind of an improvisational relationship between the dungeon master and the players, and the chaptered book kind of structure, where there is a definitive plot for the players to go down. And you, of course, have to find a happy medium between this, because if you go for a predetermined plot, your players will not act in the exact way that you want them to, and if you do a sandbox, they're going to get bored. You need plot hooks, and you need those plot hooks to eventually have climaxes and resolutions, because otherwise they're not going to feel satisfied. So what we'll be covering here is a happy medium, but a little bit more focus on the storytelling element of it, because that is what's getting more and more popular, and that's what's drawn a lot of people to Dungeons & Dragons, is the prospect of that storytelling. If you're telling a more improvisational, sandbox-heavy campaign, that's fine, just a lot of this will not be applicable. The first thing to know about where you want to fall on this balance is it will inform the length of your adventure. If you have a story campaign, a campaign that is more railroading the players into a particular action, that will be a shorter campaign. And if you want to run a shorter campaign, you'll have to railroad the players a certain degree. Now you can disguise this and you can definitely make it fun for them, but there has to be a certain degree of acknowledgement. We want to get this finished in 3 sessions. Well, the story has to happen. Whereas if you have less of an idea where you want the story to go, if you just want to have like a continuous thing with your friends, a more sandbox kind of thing, you should know that that is likely to go on for longer, because the more sandbox you are, the more sidetracked you get, the less you're going to finish what that main story is. The backbone work that you have to do before you start a campaign is you have to inform your players about the world, the themes, and what kind of plot hooks they're going to see. You do this because it informs character creation, and it sets a tone for your story. You might be a little bit hesitant to share too much about your campaign because you want things to be surprises to players. But if a player goes in expecting a pirate campaign and they find a desert-themed campaign, neither you nor they are going to be happy because it's going to break the immersion. So you need to do that backbone work before you start working on something, and you need to share it. You need to come up with the general world, and this world can be as simple as I'm doing something set in Lord of the Rings. You can just steal a world from somewhere, or you can do the deep dive, 8 nations, 8 continents, 1,000 nations within each of them, whatever you want. That's fine. Know that likely your adventure will take place someplace small first, and that is what you want to build out before you get to any of the big things, because the small is what your players will see. Second, you should think about themes. Generally, what touchstones do you want to go on? This is a story that you are telling. It's a game, but it's also, there needs to be a narrative to it. And so if you can have a certain set of themes or a certain set of recurring elements that you can just touch on, or it's a metaphor for something, that will go a long way towards shaping your narrative. And then finally, plot hooks. There are different kinds of plot hooks, from very sudden in media res, you are being attacked by bandits kind of plot hooks, to slow drawn out, you get to see the city, you get to slowly introduce yourself to everything in this enormous city that we will be playing in, and you slowly kind of pick up a few hints as you're settling in of a grander conspiracy kind of thing. But you need to communicate all of that. Communicating the world, signaling those themes, and signaling what kind of plot hooks you'll be leaving early on in the campaign. And that's more to the point. It's not just something that your players need to know, it's something that you need to know. As long as you have world, themes, and plot hooks, you are golden from there. It's nice to have a general outline past that, but oftentimes improv has to happen, and you have to go down routes that you didn't know before, and having a knowledge of the world, whether it's kind of a noir detective kind of world where everybody will speak all hard-boiled when players confront them, or whether it's a more strict or a more standard fantasy world. It's a good thing to know. Knowing those themes lets you just come back to them and create importance for the players. And knowing the plot hooks allows you to be adaptable with where those plot hooks are. With all of this established, the next thing that you want to think before you start outlining exactly what the story is going to be is you want to think, my players are the protagonists. How are they going to impact the story? It is no fun just passively watching D&D happen to you. When you sit down to play D&D, you want to affect change, or many people do. There are some people who are just kind of along for the ride, and that's fun, but there will be at least one player at your table who wants to sit down and make something happen. I guarantee it. And so expect to let those players shape where your story goes. You can always rearrange things, you can always improvise in the moment. Improv is a necessary skill towards DMing. You don't have to be perfect or comedic or dramatic with it, but you need to be quick enough on your feet that you can redirect things around to where the plot should be if you need to, or redirect the plot around to where the players are, if you can. Good example is just like if you need people to go to a castle and they take the wrong way and they want to investigate someplace else, maybe the thing that's in the castle is no longer in a castle. Or maybe the castle is in the east direction instead of the west. Those things are easy things to fill out. The ultimate thing that this leads to is keeping the pacing up. Like, sure, you can let your players exhaust their opportunities elsewhere. They can go to that castle, or they can go to the area where the castle isn't, and they can have they can waste a bunch of time delving around in the forest. You can have lots of encounters that don't particularly mean anything, and that's fun. But if you want to keep your story going, you want to have a sense of pacing. Pacing and structure are ultimately what it comes down to when you're creating an actual story. Because you can sit down and you can play like an encounter of D&D, and you can have like a fun improv kind of session, and that's more in the realm of a sandbox type thing. But if you're figuring out how to play the story, you need to know how you want to pace it and how you want to structure it. Now, I do have some recommendations, and this varies based on the campaign, it varies based on the DM, and it varies based on the group. However, my recommendation from what I've seen is that you should keep the pacing quick, because people have a lot going on in their lives, and they like to do exciting things a lot in D&D. They like when a lot of stuff happens at once, and they feel overwhelmed for a moment, and their characters get to be badass, and they're like, oh, holy shit, we fought a dragon today, we went to a vampire castle, that kind of thing. You don't want to overspeed it, you don't want to be rushed, but when your D&D campaign, your recreational activity is a slog to get through, you begin to have a problem. This is a game that you're playing with your friends. There's no veneer of professionalism here. If people are sitting through a slog of a game that you're creating, they're doing so out of politeness to you. There's no obligation here or anything, and you want people to be having a good time. That's why you're doing this. So I would recommend making sure that you keep that pace relatively quick. If you notice people going off in a direction, you don't have anything planned for it, if you know it will just be a waste of time. If it's an interesting direction, sure, go with it and see if you can tie it in there. See if you can make the plot somewhere else. But use that improvisation, use that quickness on your feet to make sure that the next plot point is where it needs to be for the story to keep moving forward. It's worth noting here, and this is something that I rarely see discussed and I rarely see followed, but it's kind of assumed that leveling happens something like once every 10 sessions or once every 6 sessions or so. If you read the Dungeon Master's Guide, they have a very explicit set of recommendations. They say, if you're starting at first level, after session 1, you should level up to second level. A session after that, or a session or two after that, they should level up to third level. And then from then on, you should have 2 or 3 sessions in between each level up. They very explicitly recommend a quick pace. They say, I think, in the text there, that your players will get bored with their current abilities and will feel like they're not making progress if you don't keep up a decent leveling margin. It also helps your players know how far they are along. I've seen plenty of campaigns, or I've been in plenty of campaigns where I'm kind of tracking where the story is by what level we are. I know the DM has like a set end level point, be it level 20 or level 8 or something like that, and I get, it helps me with the tone to know what level we are. If we're level 8, if we're going to level 8 in a campaign and we're at level 7 right now, I am taking everything so much more seriously because I know things are reaching some sort of climactic point. Now that's not an absolute word of law. Like everything in the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Player's Handbook, they have a huge disclaimer, do whatever you want. So you can deviate it, but that's what it says. It says every 2 to 3 sessions, level up. Finally, structure. And the structure of your game is perhaps the most important and the most difficult to get right, because unlike when you are just sitting and plotting out a novel, it can be ruined by any number of things, including all the time the players. So here's a couple of ways to go about it. First off, for your overall campaign and for each individual section and adventure and everything, I would recommend applying a very loose version of the 3-act structure, which is first act, exposition, getting to know the world, getting to know the characters, we're having a good time, we're introducing things. Second act, the players are committed to the adventure and they're going through all of the trials and tribulations, a big sway of up and down as different victories and defeats. Finally, there is a grand moment of climactic tension at the end of the second act that leaves them worried about the climax and rushing to move towards the end of the adventure and prevent whatever the oppositional force is doing, or make sure they can do in time whatever they're trying to do. They don't have to be purely reactionary. And then that third act, you have that final showdown. If you just apply this structure, you see it everywhere. You see it in movies, season arcs of TV, books even. You have a vague sense of what a story is. It's tried and it's true. It's proven. The 3-act structure works, and it is a vague enough guideline that it works within D&D. And you still know kind of generally the benchmarks that you want to hit, even if you get horribly off track. On a more macro note, when you're planning your campaign, I have my own set of 3 structures that you can apply to a general campaign, which I call the TV show structure, the book structure, and the movie structure. And it's a lot about the vibe of your campaign. If it's a movie structure, it is just one big plot. It is one, we have to collect these 7 artifacts, we know this from the first scene, or else Tiamat will rise from this ancient pedestal. We've known this from the first scene, and we finally come down and we face Tiamat at the end. It's just one continuous story. The sessions feel like direct continuations of each other instead of episodic pieces. The benefit of this, you have a very, very cohesive story. The The downside of this is that if your players get bored of what you're doing, they never have a break. There is no ending in sight except the end of the campaign, which is never something you want your players to look forward to. You always want to end a campaign. You never want your players to want it to end. You want them to like the ending, or you want them to want the ending but not want it to end. Then there is the TV show structure. And the TV show structure is a lot more about, okay, this individual session is going to have its own little arc, and it's going to have its own little adventure. And then the next session will have its own little arc and its own little adventure. And there will be these general overarching kind of things that we're going towards. But we want to make sure that every session is its own kind of miniature story. And this can be very, very fun. This is the upsides of this arc is that you get novelty, and you get new sets of adventures every session, and your players always feel like they're making progress. The downside of this is that it gets very rushed for time. If you're trying to wrap up a story in even a small little adventure in a larger story in a single session, you are often having to railroad players. You are often having to cut short role play in order to just get everything done in time. A more loosened version of this is maybe a good structure, maybe something like 2 or 3 sessions to finish a single episode or something. But at that point, you start getting into the book structure, which is the structure that I personally like to use in my campaigns, but is by no means the best structure. The idea is you have an overarching story that you have in mind, and then you have, and I haven't seen this done a lot, but I found it a very, very useful tool, is very strictly bookended chapters in between each things. Even going so far as to say, literally, this is chapter 1 ends at this point. Keeping very strictly delineated sets of adventures within a larger cohesive thing. Have characters that cross over. Have a setting that holds all of these adventures. But if you have like these big arcs that are maybe like 4 or 5 sessions long or so, and you can make that a chapter, have a horror arc, have a political intrigue arc, have an arc that is focused on one character and then an arc that's focused on another character. You can do this in the TV show and movie type structure, but the chapter structure, the book chapter structure really lets you clearly delineate which sections of the story are which sections. Now what this means is that the overarching story does suffer a little bit from tonal problems, because you are changing the tone and you are changing the adventure, and it really becomes about the individual arcs and the individual characters, more than it becomes about the grander story. So if you have an idea for just the grandest story that you want to tell, and one story, I would not recommend the chapter structure, because the chapter structure is more good at sustaining player interest by giving them varied sets of arcs with the same characters to let those characters respond to varied situations, than taking a singular story and telling it in the most meaningful way possible. This is not a structure that you should use for a single story. Okay, so we have all of the general philosophies of plotting out your story. The trouble now is doing it in practice. So there's the 3-act structure. How do we apply that? We have that beginning, the middle, set of challenges and tribulations, and then the end, final climax, everything happens. I'm going to give 2 examples here that I've just written out very quickly. These aren't fantastic adventures. It all depends based on execution. But these are both workable adventures, one for a single session, very short adventure that could take place within a longer campaign or just be a one shot, and one that is a much grander scale thing with no details practically filled out. So here is a very simple quest line. We start in Act 1. The adventurers are at a tavern hired to take care of a band of marauding goblins. They go into the forest. Act 1 is done. Navigating traps laid in the woods for them and fighting goblin party after goblin party. This is Act 2. They're going through different challenges. However, they become lost, and when they double back, they find the goblin corpses that they have laid in their wake are gone. Heading towards the goblin village, they discover that a powerful necromancer is reanimating the goblins when they die and preparing them for an all-out assault on the town in which the players were hired. So you have a big changing of the stakes. Good thing to happen in the middle of Act 2. The necromancer escapes the players and goes to launch their assault on the town. When the adventurers arrive, their trusty tavern is already burning. So now we have personal stakes for the characters, and the necromancer has escaped. This is the worst thing that could possibly have happened, and they have to launch into Act 3 now. They have to have that final showdown. With the necromancer cackling in the central square and guards being held back by the goblin horde, it's clear that the party needs to jump into a fight with the necromancer. So, this is one session, no character growth, no complicated emotions behind anything, no need to tell the most grandiose story in this. This is just applying that structure to a short little adventure, something that will be fun for your players. You get twists, you get turns, you get a variety of different situations. You're not always doing the same thing through the whole adventure, and you are not wandering and aimless, and there is a clear plot for you to follow. And here is a basic 3-act structure applied to a whole campaign. And this can be done in either the chapter structure, the book structure, the TV show structure, or the movie structure. It can work any of the ways. But here's planning out like a whole grand campaign, the awesome campaign that you want to run. Your adventurers meet each other for the first time after being called by strange dreams to an ancient ruin. So we have, at the beginning of Act 1, they're getting to know each other. Deep within the ruin, they discover evidence of a secret society of mages that their ancestors were involved with. They follow that path, uncover the secret order, who tell them that they can learn more by seeking out objects of their ancestry. Now the adventurers must go to their homes and confront their backstories and families, allowing for some powerful roleplay. So that is an Act 1 that could span maybe 1 or 2 chapters, or even like the first 15, that's a bit long in my opinion, but like the first 15 sessions of your campaign, maybe the first 5 sessions, maybe the first 3 sessions, something like that. And following that, we launch into Act 2. However, going on the series of simple fetch quests facing different challenges in each place, getting into that nice Act 2 stuff, halfway through this series of simple fetch quests, they discover that the Order was split in 2 long ago, and that half of their ancestors were evil summoners ready to unleash monsters from the abyss, and that those families still carry on those dark practices. So you have that changing of the stakes in Act 2. Things change. They are facing a different kind of challenge than the simple monster fighting kind of thing that they were before. Now the adventurers have powerful enemies to face, their own families. Furthermore, as they investigate still further, they find that their families are preparing a ritual that could unleash monsters beyond the adventurers' comprehensions. So at this point, they are fighting against their families, and their families could spell the doom of the world. You have a reason that they care about this climax more than they've cared about all of the different fights that have come before, and you have an emotional gut punch that will push the characters into that final climax. And we end Act 2. They go to try and stop it, but fail to do anything but heartbreakingly kill their own families. The monsters, this could also serve as the transition into Act 3, depending on how you want to pace this. The monsters are now loose, and the adventurers must now hunt them down in time before they can ruin the kingdom. So you can either have the knowledge, this just shows how flexible that structure is, because you can present the knowledge that their families are the ones summoning these great creatures as that darkest point, and then have that death of the family be part of the climax, if you want. And that's a shorter, keep the pace up kind of thing, and that will work perfectly well as a plot point too, or as a darkest point at the end of Act 2. And as a climax. Or you can go the other route and have them find out about the families midway through Act 2 and have a long stretched out part before they finally have to deal with their families once and for all, and have their success even be the saddest point in the story and the point that propels them with a partial failure into that final hunting of the monsters. Either one of them work, depending on your player's choices, because again, they're the protagonists in the story. You can go whatever direction you want. So, I hope that this has been an informative and somewhat helpful way to think about plotting out your own campaigns. Again, for more information on encounter balance, on the specifics of skill challenges, on how to run all of these role-play elements, all of those specifics, find those in previous and future Trojan Adventuring Party workshops. And today, I hope you have a good time with your homebrew campaign.